The September 18th City of Vandalia Council meeting is now called to order. We'll start with a moment of reflection, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Please stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we have no minutes to approve, and that brings us to communications, petitions, and awards. The first item is the introduction and oath of office for Fire Marshal Scott Jacobs. Mr. Wendt?
Thank you very much, Your Honor. I'd like to reintroduce, I know that you already know Fire Marshal Scott Jacobs. He's been with the city for some time. He's got a lot of varying capacity, both as a part-time fire lieutenant here at the city of Vandalia, working at the city of Dayton, and most recently as our community risk reduction coordinator at the city. Fire Marshal Jacobs exhibits an extremely high level of customer service. He's somebody that you can send into a business to work with young people or staff internally for training or information, and you know that he's going to represent you well as the city. And so without further ado, I'll ask his family to come up here with him, and we'll go ahead and swear him in as fire marshal.
I hope so. I know, a lot.
I, Scott Jacobs, solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution and will obey the laws of the United States and of the state of Ohio.
Notice how the camera
That I will in
looks
all
like it's pointed over that way now.
observe the provisions of the charter and ordinances of the city of Vandalia, and will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of fire marshal within the division of fire.
Kid doesn't know what to do.
Congratulations.
Your Honor, moving right along, if I may. I'd like to invite Mr. Chris Franzmann from, he's a partner at Squire, Patton, Boggs LLP. You'll remember Mr. Franzmann, who came to speak to the city last year regarding the tax increment financing. He's, of course, an expert in several fields relating to municipal finance, and hopefully he lives up to that today. No, I'm just kidding, Chris. It's good to see you back
I'll
here.
try.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invite. Congratulations to the fire marshal. That's a terrific accomplishment. And I'm just happy that the fire department and half the audience didn't leave before my presentation, so I feel a little bit better.
Really should have given them the chance to. I'm really
Well,
regretting
they still
it.
can if they want to. It's
Yeah,
going to be
guys,
riveting.
if you want to go, you can go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay, I see the city manager, I know, shared with you the memo that we put together late last week. It talks about debt limitations, legal debt limitations for an Ohio municipality. I'm going to assume that everybody's had maybe even a chance to skim it, if not read it. So I'm not going to go through it in great detail. I'm just going to give some highlights. So essentially, a brief step back into history. The last time Ohio convened a constitutional convention was in 1912. So 111 years ago was the last time this state's constitution was meaningfully changed. And as part of those changes, there was a focus on debt limitations, controlling indebtedness, controlling borrowing. At the end of the day, this council, trustees, commissioners, the Ohio General Assembly are all stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So it was thought back then that it would be appropriate to put in place legal limitations on how much money can be borrowed, okay? And so that was a long time ago. Things have changed since then. Some debt limitations have been added, some have been changed over the years. So where we are today, and they can't all be the same, right? To make my life as a bond lawyer easier, school districts are different from townships, are different from municipalities, different from the state of Ohio. So we're going to talk specifically about municipalities. And I will also say that some chartered municipalities, they have the ability to change their debt limits a little bit, and some have done that as well, although this municipality has not. So when we talk about debt limitations for municipalities, we really talk about two debt limitations, and we refer to them generally as the direct debt limitation and the indirect debt limitation. The direct debt limitation is direct in the sense that it's a pretty simple computation. You look at the tax valuation of the municipality, you multiply it by either 5.5% or 10.5% to get the total amount of debt, principal amount of debt that can be outstanding at any one time. The 5.5% applies to unvoted general obligation debt, and 10.5% applies to a combination of unvoted and voted general obligation debt. Okay? The nice thing about this limitation is that the General Assembly has provided a number of exemptions to this computation. Of note, they include debt that's backed by special assessments, debt that is backed by enterprise funds, namely water, sewer, revenue systems, as well as, in the case of unvoted debt, debt that's backed by income taxes. So it's pretty common practice for myself with my clients, including the city of Vandalia, that when you have passed ordinances in the past for note issues or bond issues, buried in that very exciting document that you read that I draft is a pledge of income taxes. The reason that pledge is in there is for this reason, so we can exempt it from the direct debt limitations. So as I noted in the memo, actually, I think it was on maybe page 2, at the top up there, none of the city's outstanding general obligation debt counts against the direct debt limits because we have either pledged income taxes or we have pledged enterprise funds. Okay? So the one that's more relevant for the discussion tonight and unfortunately more complicated to explain is the indirect debt limitation. So a couple of quick things right off the top. The indirect debt limitation only applies to unvoted general obligation debt. And so let me just take a moment because I know that it sometimes feels like bond lawyers are speaking in code. So general obligation debt is debt that is paid from the full faith and credit and general taxing power of the municipality. It would be similar to any of us individually going to the bank and signing a note and committing to repay the note. If we do that, that is in effect our general obligation. We are committing to the bank to pay from whatever lawfully available source we have that debt, okay? The reason general obligation debt is so popular, particularly with municipalities, is because it is the most secure debt that you can issue, again, because it's paid from all lawfully available monies. Since it is the most secure debt, it is also the debt that carries the lowest cost of borrowing. Okay? And in most cases for municipalities, you typically are not running up against debt limitations. So it's easy to authorize, it's easy to issue, and it carries the lowest interest rate, the lowest cost of borrowing. Compare that, for example, to school districts who have been, in effect, penalized by the General Assembly. Their ability to issue unvoted general obligation debt is significantly limited by the Ohio Revised Code. That's why, more often than not, when we go to vote and we're voting on a bond issue, that bond issue is for the local school district. That's why local school districts are always on the ballot for bond issues. They have some very limited ability to issue certain types of debt without the vote of the electorate, but most of it needs to be approved by the voters. But we don't have that problem because our debt limitations are different. So when we talk about the indirect debt limitation, it really goes back in time more or less to the Constitution of 1912, when the only real source of revenue that a municipality had was its property taxes. There was no income tax back then, certainly not at the local level, not even at the federal level back in 1912. There were not other types of revenues, typically like sewer and water systems. It's basically property taxes. So for the longest time, the way the Constitution was drafted and the way it was interpreted by bond lawyers was that you needed to pledge property taxes to support a bond issue. And to control the amount of overall debt on a property owner, the indirect debt limitation was developed. So again, this only applies to unvoted general obligation debt, and I'm going to touch on debt in a moment, which was beyond the scope of the letter. In other words, I didn't have time to include it, so I apologize. But basically what this says is it imposes a limit of 10 mils. So we've all heard of the unvoted limitation of 10 mils, the inside millage, okay? What this limitation basically says is that out of the unvoted 10 mils, all debt from all of the overlappers with the city, meaning the county, Montgomery County, the overlapping township, the overlapping school district, all of their unvoted debt must be able to be paid from the inside millage. Okay? Quick aside, there are provisions in the Ohio Revised Code that do say if certifications are filed by a subdivision and the inside millage needs to be invaded to pay debt service, then the County Budget Commission has to do that. Okay, so debt service comes first on the inside mills. Fortunately, that almost never happens, but that's the law. So the computation, which is really controlled by the county auditor's office by statute, the computation basically goes like this. We have our annual debt service for unvoted general obligation debt. It's X dollars. If we have a tax valuation of Y dollars, how many mills, doing the math, would it take to be levied against our tax valuation to cover our debt service for that year? Then you do that same computation for the county and the township and the local school district and whatever other overlapper, perhaps sometimes like a regional transit authority, that could have access to that inside millage. You add all of those up and they cannot exceed 10 mils. So that's what I've talked about in the letter. So when we talk about the indirect debt capacity, we first look and see how much is currently being used. And again, this computation comes from the county auditor. We do our best to double check it. But currently, as of the last note issue that we closed last month, we were at a total of 3.9998. When I say we, I mean us overlapping with everybody else. That's how much we were using. And so, if Dan, are you controlling? If somebody could scroll up a little bit higher, the prior page, and then down a little bit more. And at the bottom of that second to the last paragraph right there, we're at roughly $29.7 million of capacity. Now, another caveat on this computation, this if you saw the math behind this, you'd probably roll your eyes because it's kind of silly. But also the variables are kind of silly. And the reason they're silly is because it can change daily. Because what this does is it looks at your current tax valuation, your debt service, what the interest rate is on that debt service, what the annual payments are on that debt service, and those variables are applied for all of the overlappers. And so we know right now that we're roughly at 29.7 because the debt that it takes into account is all out in the market and it's fixed. The interest rates are fixed, the payments are fixed. But then when we are asked the question, what is our remaining capacity, and when we try to compute the 29.7, that depends on a number of variables. That depends on if we go out into the market, do we go out into the market for 15 years? Do we go out for 20 years or 25 years? Are we going out at an average interest rate of 4.5% or 5% or 5.5%? So, Dan, if you could please scroll down to the next page. The reason that I put that table that appears towards the top of the page, that is, those are that represents in that matrix roughly the amount of millage that would be used for the city of Vandalia to issue $1 million of unvoted GO debt at the corresponding term and interest rates. So for purposes of this example, for purposes of the amount of debt, as I understand it, is being considered in some way, shape, or form by this council, at the top of the memo is roughly $24 million. The paragraph that appears below the matrix recites what I just said about this table reflects $1 million of borrowing at 5% for 20 years. So if we did that, that would use 0.2018 mils. Again, assuming the county hasn't issued anything, the school district hasn't issued anything, the township hasn't issued anything. So if we do some simple math, we multiply 0.2018 by 24 million, we end up using 4.84 mils. And if we add that to the total millage currently being used of 3.998, we get to 8.84. So then we do the backwards calculation, and we say if we've used 8.843, and the most we can use is 10, how much debt could we then borrow again for 20 years at 5%? And that comes out to approximately 5.7 million for us, all others being considered equal. The next paragraph demonstrates what happens to the overlappers if we were to issue that amount of debt. And so the reason ours drops from 29 to roughly 5 or 6, and the Montgomery counties drops from 827 to 159 is because our tax valuation is much smaller than the counties. So when we chew up millage, it really affects all the other overlappers, okay? If the roles were reversed and Montgomery County did $24 million of debt, it would barely affect any of us because their tax valuation is so high. It's so much, okay? So that's a lot of me talking about a pretty complicated topic. But let me stop there because I do want to talk about debt for a moment. But before I do that, let me just stop talking and see if there are any questions about the nature of this limitation, the way it's computed, anything else. Yes, sir.
I've been dying to ask this. So in a place where, say we have a neighboring jurisdiction that maybe has a greater debt issuance or their millage equivalent, are there other places in Montgomery County that have provided significant limitations to the county as a whole or the school district, or are there any sort of stories that you know about in our county where that's occurred?
There's another community that is in Montgomery and another county who at one point had gotten fairly high, Dan. Of note, I had this happen. So the short answer is not really. My advice to clients is when we get above 8 mils, when I'm working on a deal that's going to take us above 8 mils, I call the client and we have a conversation about exactly this. I consider that sort of a yellow flag warning. When we get above 9 mils, it's a red flag warning because now we're limiting our ability to issue unvoted geodebt for really anything. Okay, it's really putting, it's something that the policymakers, this body, really needs to think about, and that's why I want to talk about the concept of debt in a moment. And this is actually a good segue, Dan. So I had another community right after the Great Recession that was pushing up into the 9 mil territory. Part of that was because an overlapping township had done some debt. Its tax valuation was not as big as the municipalities. So now we know that when the lower tax value municipality or taxing subdivisions issue debt, it causes a greater impact to the amount of millage that's being used. And so the financing team, the senior staff, myself, the city's municipal advisor, all huddled, and we came up with a plan. We restructured some debt. We moved some geo debt that had been issued for the electric system off the geo side of the ledger, put it on the revenue side of the ledger, which is what I want to talk about. And they, in future issuances, layered debt so we wouldn't have these abnormally high peak years that were causing a lot of drag on the 10 mil limit. So again, your 10 mil limit's based on your annual debt service. So we feathered debt in. So there are ways to deal with this if it happens. Okay? But again, this applies to unvoted geo debt. So let me transition unless there's any questions.
So the unvoted geo debt, the 10 mil cap, is that basically first come, first serve?
Yes.
Okay. And so there's no legal obligation for any of the taxing authorities to get permission from somebody else or
No.
or anything else? It's just whoever gets to the market first and gets the
Yes.
bond. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about debt. So you're probably thinking, what's he talking about debt? Debt is debt, right? Well, not exactly. And the reason that it's not, and this is not addressed in the memo, the Ohio Supreme Court, over the years, since 1912, has had occasion to review cases where they were evaluating what is debt and what would count against this indirect debt limitation, okay? And so there are some exceptions. And for example, one exception, probably the most obvious, is voted debt. So there, I have communities, I have clients that will, municipalities rarely issue voted debt, again, because of their much larger debt limitations compared to some of the other types of subdivisions. But there are times, rec centers come to mind. It's not uncommon for rec centers to be voted on because they want the public to put the seal of approval on the project. So voted debt does not count against this 10 mil limitation. Debt that is backed solely by enterprise funds, sewer and water particularly, does not count against this. In my world, we call that revenue debt. Revenue debt can be issued out into the capital markets like we issue our geo debt. The documentation provides that it is paid solely from the net revenues of the water system or the sewer system. It's not payable at all from tax revenues. So that is not debt in the eyes of the Ohio Supreme Court when it comes to this limitation. Loans that you get from OWDA and OPWC, to the extent they're paid from water and sewer, are also considered revenue debt for purposes of those holdings. So OWDA debt does not count against the indirect debt limitation. So for example, one way to address an issue with the indirect debt limit is to, for sewer and water debt, to perhaps borrow from OWDA instead of issuing general obligation debt, okay? Lease financings are another exception. Municipalities rarely do these. You see them more in the context of school districts. I mean, municipalities rarely do them for large projects. It's pretty routine to do them for like cop cars. We're going to buy 5 cop cars, we're going to do a lease financing through the bank, no big deal. That actually is not debt, according to the Ohio Supreme Court. The reason that it's not debt and the reason that the way it must be structured this way so it's not debt, in that it is subject to annual appropriations. So those obligations are subject to an annual appropriation of city council. If there's a non-appropriation, then the deal's over and the assets are recovered by the lessor. But because it's subject to an annual appropriation, there's no penalties if you fail to appropriate. That is not debt that would count against the 10 mil limitation. Okay? So we're not going to do a lease financing for roads and sewers, but for other types of assets like buildings, it is a possibility. Okay? So those are examples of what we would consider to be debt that are not really debt, that really don't count against this limitation. Again, the last thing I would say is those other types of borrowings, they do cost a little bit more. And I know Mr. Brossart was here Thursday night. I know he touched on some of these issues. But for example, if you issue debt that's paid solely from the revenue system, the water revenues, it's a limited source of repayment compared to our general obligation debt that is a much broader source of repayment. So it just stands to reason that that type of debt would bear a little bit higher cost of interest. Okay? So those are those are the legal debt limitations for municipality.
Can I split the debt?
You can split the debt. And you certainly, if it's this body has the ability to choose at the time of authorization, hopefully with my input, the nature of the project and the type of financing that we're going to pursue. But, for example, if, and I'm making this up just as an example. Let's say we had a $10 million sewer project, and the rates on the revenue side were going to be 5.5% a year, and the rates on the geo side were going to be 4.5% a year. We absolutely could issue whatever percentage of revenue debt and whatever percentage of unvoted geo debt to combine the proceeds to pay for the cost of the project. Okay, so we can issue different types of debt for the same project, or we could say this project, perhaps a better example is this project, it's a road project, so we're going to issue geo debt. The roads are not an enterprise system, obviously. They're not producing their own revenue. We'll issue unvoted general obligation debt for this road project, and then there's a sewer line project that's going to go right down the road, so we can go to OWDA and finance that, so it doesn't count against our direct debt or indirect debt limits. So the short answer is yes. We can make decisions about what tools we're using to finance projects based upon where we stand with the debt limitations and what's projected out into the future.
And this might not be within the purview of your dissertation here. We're looking at our budget for the next 5 years, and I'm thinking about general obligation debt. And because we have a fairly substantial balance within the city of cash, we're contemplating budgeting deficits, operational deficits, yearly for the next 5 years, in part to spend that corpus of that money down. Will that affect our ability to issue this debt?
So things would have to be pretty bad in your fund balances and your history for bondholders to say, I'm not buying that at all. And I'm sure Mr. Brossart, I'm pretty sure he covered this. I use a lot of personal analogies to help explain this world that I live in that seems natural to me, but I've done it for so long, I know it's not natural for folks that don't do it every day. But we all have FICO scores, right? We have a FICO score. If you go to the bank, you want to borrow money for a house or a car, somewhere in the back office, somebody's checking your FICO score. And that's going to tell the bank your individual credit worthiness, right? And that's going to directly affect your interest rate. Same thing with credit ratings for the debt markets, the fixed income markets. I think Mr. Brossart talked about this Thursday night. So the major rating agencies will assign ratings to municipalities, counties, any issuers of tax-exempt debt. And those ratings, we all know, start with AAA, and they go down into the Cs. You really don't want to be anywhere below the A's. A minus is as far as you want to go. B AAA is investment grade, and below that, it's bad news. So I don't want to sound evasive, but people will buy the debt, again, until it gets really bad. But the bigger question is, what does that do to our cost of borrowing? Because the more your rating goes down, and again, I'm sure Mr. Brossart explained this, but there's a yield curve, and I'm doing this as the way you would look at it. So shorter term typically bears a lower rate, and as you go longer term, rates typically go up. Ironically, we have what's called an inverted yield curve now. Short-term rates are actually higher than many of the long-term rates. That almost never happens, but that's where we are. But typically, we go like this. So there is a yield curve for AAA-rated tax-exempt debt, and it changes daily, goes up and down a little bit every day. And then based off of that yield curve, depending upon what your rating is, if it's not AAA, then every point on that yield curve, you're going to go up a little bit for your interest rate. And again, that changes daily. It could change 1 or 2 basis points or 5 or 6 basis points. But the lower you go down on the rating, AA plus, AA minus, A plus, A minus, the more you go up higher for interest rates. So it really becomes a question of not so much will they buy it, but rather what's it going to cost us when they do buy it. And that's about all I can say about that as a lawyer. I need to let the financial guys talk about the rest of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
One question.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the disparity in today's market, just approximately, between the OWDA percentage rates compared to the bond rates?
I honestly don't know, and I apologize.
I mean, I'm assuming they're higher.
Historically, they haven't been. They've been able to borrow at a pretty low rate. Again, that's really Mr. Brossart's role to evaluate the most effective cost of borrowing. The OWDA program, again, what the engineers have told me, sometimes has some hoops and hurdles you got to jump through and over, and sometimes they don't want to deal with that. I've heard some, and the other problem with OWDA is it's typically not prepayable. So you're locked in. So what I'm hearing the municipal advisory world say nowadays, and Mr. Brossart's a municipal advisor, is that in the past, when the rates had been at truly historic lows, the fact that you couldn't prepay OWDA debt, and you can prepay bonds that we issue typically somewhere between 7 to 10 years after they're issued, you can prepay the bonds we issue. That the risk of not being able to prepay OWDA debt wasn't really a risk because rates really couldn't get any lower. So if you were stuck with that rate for 20 years, it wasn't a big deal. With the recent escalation in rates, all rates, everybody's rates, if one were to conclude that perhaps rates might come down again in the near future and you can't prepay OWDA, then maybe you're stuck with a higher rate. So I know the municipal advisors are taking a much more analytical approach to OWDA than they had in recent years.
Makes sense.
But again, that's a financial evaluation that I probably shouldn't be making, at least not in public.
And the restrictions on the OWDA, is that strictly backed by revenue?
Yes.
So if, for example, a public works facility, that we would be paying debt down from multiple funds, including utility funds, that in theory could split
They,
or no?
I don't know the answer to that specifically. I think it's worth inquiring OWDA about. The issue with OWDA is they have a standard set of documents, okay? They do not require a bond counsel opinion like the capital markets does. It's essentially our document or no deal. So I don't know how they would approach a public works facility that had multiple uses, including water and sewer. It may be that they're willing to do some sort of allocation to that cost and then have you pledge water and sewer funds to the allocated portion of the cost of the project. It's certainly something staff could check into and give it, call OWDA and see how they would approach that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
informative.
Appreciate it.
Yes.
And you don't mind if I leave? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we have no public hearing, and that brings us to comments from interested citizens. So if anyone would like to make a comment, please come to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and your comments.
Good evening.
Hi.
I'm Barbara Spurgeon, 777 North Edge Drive, Vandalia. Just a couple of things that when I'm in the community, I see it's just not getting any better, is the Delco property. It just keeps looking more and more like a jungle. I just wondered if there's any plans for that property. And also the Burger King on 40 is standing vacant. I didn't know, I'd heard some, I don't know how true it is, but I heard like maybe there's some homeless people that have been trying to get in there. And then the hotel, the Super 8 Hotel, which has been an ongoing, thing, so it's burned again. So I didn't know, I know there's probably insurance issues and investigation to continue, so I didn't know if there's plans for it to reopen, or it just looks awful. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to.
Would staff like to answer those three questions?
Yes, Your Honor, I'll do my best. With regard to 250 North Woods, over the summer, we have met a couple of times with the proprietors there, and we've expressed some of the concerns that we have about the maintenance of the property. I know that they did a little bit of work ahead of Air Show. I have another meeting coming up with them before the end of the month, and we'll reiterate those concerns. One of the things that City Council has asked us to take a look at as staff is the restrictions that we have within our zoning and property maintenance code relating to large sites. So as it's written currently, there are some challenges with doing enforcement on a larger than 10-acre industrial type of site, and so that might require some legislative action to be able to really be effective. But we will reiterate that when we meet with them. With regard to, is that satisfactory for the moment on Ms. Spurgeon?
So what does it look positive? Is there plans to see improvement in the future? I mean.
So right now, there's a gentleman whose name is Kevin Brock from Brock Air Products. And what he is looking to do is have some components, some manufacturing, some distribution, storage and distribution of HVAC components that are in it, and then I think he also sells grills, so they do like sheet metal work within there, and so that's who is primarily working on occupying the space at this time, and so that's kind of who we're working with. They're kind of gearing up, working on their certificate of occupancy, and so the short answer is, I think the answer is yes. We're limited in the amount of teeth that we have with the code right now as far as enforcement of that type of property. And then we're going to work on that to research and bring proposals back to City Council.
So it'll be another industry type thing that we can, that'll maybe, another industry thing that'll probably occupy maybe?
Oh,
Or-
the occupants there, it is an industrial
Yeah.
use,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay,
With regard to, did I answer your question completely?
yeah, you
Okay.
did, you did.
With regard to the Burger King, when it's on private property, if we see something suspicious, we'll ask the police officers, or if they're going by, they'll go and they'll take a look. And so there have been cases when that happened, generally when there's something going on that, if somebody sets up a tent there and they're there for 3 or 4 days, we look to our property maintenance inspectors to respond to that and enforce the code.
Okay,
And I do believe that there has been contact made with the property owner who may have trespassed 1 or 2 people off of that property. And so there are some individuals who the city tends to, kind of chase around from property to property, and they have to be trespassed or given a trespass warning on each one of those.
okay,
Does that make sense with the Burger King?
yeah.
Yeah, that also is, it's my understanding that that is part of a package with many Burger Kings. And so when somebody looks to acquire that property, it's quite possible that it's coming with a whole package of Burger Kings. And so I don't have any indication of what that plan is at this point.
Okay.
With regard to the Super 8 motel, I know that the fire chief and the fire marshal have conducted investigations, and so with the building department, that's all relatively recent where they've assessed that damage. That's going to stay closed for a while. I do believe, based on the last information that I've gotten, that they intend to work towards making repairs and opening back up. Chief, is that?
Yeah, they started remediation of the unburned sections this week.
Yeah,
Okay, it's always been a trouble spot for
absolutely.
the city.
And I don't know if Law Director McDonald would like to talk about the consent agreement that the city negotiated, and its applicability or the standards in it.
Once they operate, they're on a rather short leash in terms of activities that are prohibited where we can pull their permit pretty easily. Unfortunately, with the fire, they are not under their normal operating procedures, so they're closed again, but we're working on them to have the security there, and we had them reboard the place. So we're trying to do things to keep it crime-free while they make their changes, or
Okay.
while they do the fix.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to make a comment?
My name is Cindy Dugan, 794 Walt Smith Way. Speaking of the Delphi plant, have you heard anything about the mitigation or the responsibility for the mitigation?
This is Ms. Dugan, this is in relation to the ground contamination?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I would, I think I would defer to the Assistant City Manager. Is she behind you? I can't see her from here. To give an update regarding the relationship between CERTA, Xerion Battery, and their remediation period. So,
Okay, I'll talk to her.
yeah, and I mean, Amber, if you want to step up and you want to inform the body, I feel like I'll screw up the months and the years, so I want to make sure I get that correct.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got it down to months and years, but the building is currently the building at 250 Northwoods Boulevard is currently owned by CERTA. This is a company that has purchased other manufacturing buildings within the region. It is being leased to a company called Xerion Battery, which you all are familiar with on council. And it's being now sublet to Mr. Kevin Brock, who was mentioned earlier. CERTA is the party involved in the remediation of the site. They've been working with the EPA. They've done extensive work already. They went to Chicago to work with the EPA and get a plan in place to bring this site into compliance and get it fixed up. And so I'm not sure how much longer they have on their timeline. I believe it's still a couple of years out for the work that they're doing on this remediation, but they are actively still continuing that work to bring the site into compliance.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else that'd like to make a comment? All right, we'll move on to the city manager's report where we have some information items.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. The October is Fire Prevention Month. The Division of Fire Open House will be October 1st at noon to 2 p.m. In honor of Fire Prevention Month, the Division of Fire will host that open house, and that'll be at Station 1. I would take a moment to inform you that last week Chief Althouse flew to Washington, D.C. with the Coalition Against Bigger Trucks. He, as well as several law enforcement professionals from across the country, met with our legislators to voice concerns over opposition for proposed federal legislation to increase the size of commercial trucks and their weight. He, of course, conveyed the detrimental effects to the roadways, infrastructure, and also the safety of motorists traveling those roadways. We do have an employee appreciation event that's coming up on the 20th of September. That's at 11:30 a.m. in the Senior Center. And that is it.
All right, thank you. We have no action items, nor do we have any old business, and that brings us to our first resolution of this evening, that being Resolution 23-R-59. Mr. McDonald, by title only.
A resolution authorizing the fire chief to enter into an agreement with AP Triton to conduct a community risk assessment.
Thank you. Mr. Wendt?
Thank you, Your Honor. The Division of Fire has received a FEMA fire prevention grant for $23,071.43 to perform a community risk assessment. This was a grant that was applied for in 2021 and is part of the supplemental later today.
All right, thank you. Can I have a motion?
I move that we approve Resolution 23-R-59 as presented.
I have a motion by Councilwoman Farson, a second by Councilman Ehlers to approve Resolution 23-R-59 as presented. Are there any comments? Call the roll.
Councilmember Woods?
Yes.
Councilmember Follak?
Yes.
Councilmember Fairst?
Yes.
Councilmember Ehlers?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lewis?
Yes.
Mayor Herbst?
Yes, and the motion passes 6-0. Next, we have Resolution 23-R-60.
A resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into a master service agreement for programming phase of the engineering and design of a new public works facility with WDC Group for an amount up to $125,000.
All right, thank you. Mr. Wendt?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm recommending that the city enter into an agreement with WDG Group LLC for Phase 1 of the engineering and design process for the Public Works Facility. Phase 1 is the programming portion of the design, consisting of determining what the needs are through meetings with staff, site assessment surveys, inventory of vehicles and equipment, etc. With the programming, we will develop a concept plan and proposed cost estimates for budgeting. The cost for programming this phase of the engineering and design is set at an amount not to exceed $125,000. And this is to be paid out of the Facilities Fund 360.
Thank you. Can I have a motion?
Your Honor, I'll move to approve Resolution 23-R-60 as presented.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilman Pollack and a second by Councilwoman Woods to approve Resolution 23-R-60 as presented. Are there any comments? Call the roll.
Councilmember Follak?
Yes.
Councilmember Fairst?
Yes.
Councilmember Ehlers?
Yes.
Councilmember Woods?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lewis?
Yes.
Mayor Herbst?
Yes, the motion passes 6-0. Next, we have Resolution 23-R-61.
A resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement with SwimSafe Pool Management for aquatic staffing services at Castle Hills Pool and the Vandalia Recreation Center.
Thank you. Mr. Wendt?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Clark recently gave an update regarding the performance of Swim Safe to the City Council. They, of course, have done a great job this year at Castle Hills Pool as well as the Rec Center. I'm recommending that we enter into an agreement for Castle Hills Pool for $144,120 for 2024, $148,445 for 2025, and the agreement price for the Rec Center would be $375,138 for 2024, $386,392 for 2025, carrying through December 31st, 2025.
Thank you. Can I have a motion?
I move that we approve Resolution 23-R-61.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilman Ayers and a second by Councilman Pollak to approve Resolution 23-R-61 as presented. Are there any comments? Call the roll.
Councilmember Fairst,
Yes.
Councilmember Ayers,
Yes.
Councilmember Woods,
Yes.
Councilmember Follak,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lewis,
Yes.
Mayor Herbst.
Yes, and the motion passes 6-0. We have no ordinances in their first reading nor their second reading. We do have a couple of emergency ordinances, the first one being Emergency Ordinance 23-22. Mr. McDonald?
That motion was tabled. Is there going to be a motion to get it off the table to be voted on, or, because we would have to do that procedurally first?
All right.
Say that again.
It's tabled, so if we want to untable it, we have to vote to untable it.
No, I don't.
No.
All right. Is that related to, no. We'll move on then to Emergency Ordinance 22-23, or is that?
Can I ask a question real quick? Does it remain tabled until we take it off?
Yes,
correct?
it was tabled indefinitely, which means it
So
can just,
it will just continue to the next meeting.
To the next meeting.
yeah, it will keep showing up as long as it's on the agenda, unless someone says, I don't want it
Well,
anymore.
I just have I believe the majority of council is probably wanting to get through the rest of the budget process, especially given the presentations Thursday night and tonight from bond council before moving forward with that action item.
Right, you can then bring it back up when you're ready then, whenever council wants to vote to bring it up.
All right.
Thank you.
Emergency Ordinance 22-23.
An ordinance to revise appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures of the city of Vandalia, Montgomery County, Ohio, during calendar year ending December 31, 2023, and amending ordinance 22-42 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Mr. Wendt?
Thank you, Your Honor. Finance is requesting a supplemental for the following reasons relating to the community risk assessment for the Division of Fire. That is in the general fund, in the capital improvement plan fund for building maintenance, $34,441, an increase for unexpected expenses relating to the emergency replacement and installation of a new storm and sanitary pumping system in the municipal building. In the police fire street fund, $22,354. This is appropriations for expenses related to the replacement of the HVAC rooftop units at Fire Station 2. And then out of the Facilities Improvement Reserve Fund, that's $360. The Public Works Facility, $125,000, an increase in appropriations associated with Phase 1 of the Master Services Agreement for the Public Works Facility.
Thank you. And since this is an emergency ordinance, we'll open a public hearing. So if anyone would like to comment on this ordinance, please come to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and your comment. Being none, I'll close the public hearing. Can I have a motion?
Your Honor, I'll move that we approve ordinance 2323 as an emergency.
Second.
I have a motion by Vice Mayor Lewis and a second by Councilman Follak to approve ordinance 23-23 as an emergency. Are there any comments? Call the roll.
Councilmember Follak,
Yes.
Councilmember Fairst, Councilmember Ayers,
Yes.
Councilmember Woods,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lewis,
Yes.
Mayor Herbst.
Yes, and the motion passes 6-0. It brings us to reports from boards and commissions. Council, you've got the meeting minutes from the Bicycle Advisory Committee meeting on June 5th. We've got the Civil Service Commission meeting minutes of July 24th. Are there any comments on those? All right, we've got the August 2023 bill listing in the amount of $4,609,872.23, along with the August expenses over $50,000 and the August purchase card detail in the amount of $35,436.96. And it brings us to council comments. We'll begin with Mr. McDonald.
Nothing tonight, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wendt.
Thank you, Your Honor. In one of our recent budget hearings, we discussed updates to codified ordinance 208 on purchasing. I plan on bringing that back to you for your consideration in a study session, and then if you feel that you're able to consider that fully, based on the retreat that we had recently, then for a first reading that same day. I believe that'll be in the second meeting in October. I would also respectfully request this evening an executive session for the purpose of reviewing the city's collective bargaining strategy and to discuss certain personnel matters.
All right. Mr. McDonald, do we vote on that now, or do we do that at the end?
Whenever you decide.
All right, we'll just come back to it. Councilman Ayers.
Nothing, thank you.
Councilwoman Forrest.
I would just like to excuse Councilman Blakesley from our meeting I'm sorry. I'd like to excuse Councilman Blakesley from our meeting this evening, all meetings.
All right.
Second.
Can we do an all in favor, say aye?
Aye.
All right, thank you. Anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. Councilman Foley.
Just a thank you to staff, city manager's office, finance staff, department heads. We've been engaged in over the past 2 weeks, 3 different meetings on retreats, budget workshops for 2024. A tremendous amount of work goes into those presentations, the material that council is presented, months of work, and sometimes we give more assignments to them on short notice and ask for quick turnaround. So thank you for staff's work on all that, and as we continue down the budget process the next couple weeks, I think we'll all be better off for it. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilwoman Woods.
Yes, I just want to say that separate and apart from my role as council member, I've had the opportunity to contact the income tax department, both myself and my employees over the years, and I'm always amazed by the expediency and helpfulness and results that we get, and it's just saying that your presentation tonight, Ms. Leiter, has just really hit home with me, and it does show that your people, all of your staff, really care, and it's good to know.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Lewis.
Other than to echo Councilman Follick's comments, and thanks to all of staff. We've spent hours and hours and hours through this process, and we're not done yet, but everyone has been kind and helpful and patient with some of the inane questions that I've posed, and I really appreciate it.
Inane comments, okay. Well, has been mentioned, I do also appreciate all the hard work that staff has put into preparing the budget here for 2024. We've had, 3 really good meetings here the past week, and looking forward to getting the budget passed, and appreciate everybody's hard work. All right, it's been moved to go to executive session. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion by Vice Mayor Lewis and a second by Councilman Follick to go into executive session. Call the roll.
Councilmember Fairst? Councilmember Ayers? Yes. Councilmember Woods?
Yes.
Councilmember Follick?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lewis?
Yes.
Mayor Herbst?
Yes, the motion carries 6-0.